I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Good morning, everyone. I think we'll get started. I'm Larry Mohn, president of the Manhattan Institute. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I look forward to what I am sure will be a fascinating discussion today on the legacy of Ronald Reagan as a champion of supply-side economics. We are proud to be co-sponsoring this event with the Wall Street Journal and the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, and we are greatly indebted to the Donald and Paula Smith Foundation for generously underwriting today's conference. I also want to thank our Vice President of Communications, Lindsay Young-Craig, who initiated this partnership and who put an enormous amount of work into today's event. The only thing that could keep Lindsay away was the birth of her brand new baby girl, Alexandra, on St. Patrick's Day. But I believe she's watching from home via the internet, so hello, Lindsay, and congratulations. Today's event is really quite special to me because I started as an intern at the Manhattan Institute in 1981. The Institute's research director, George Gilder, had just published his now classic book, Wealth and Poverty. As many of you know, Wealth and Poverty made the intellectual and moral case for the supply-side revolution, and surprisingly, it became a New York Times bestseller. It also became one of Ronald Reagan's favorite books, and soon the Washington Post was calling it the Bible for his new administration. A few months before I arrived that summer, George delivered a talk for our very first Manhattan Forum. It was titled The 1980s, Era of Success, and in it he predicted that, quote, "The political revolution effected by the Republicans in 1980 will precipitate a revolution in economic thought. What's more, he predicted that supply-side economic policies were about to ignite an economic boom, and that the coming decade would come to be known as the Roaring '80s. Now, we need to step back and remember how controversial and bold, even downright crazy, these predictions seemed to be to most people at the time. After all, the economy and the stock market had been stuck in the doldrums for over a decade. Unemployment was rising, and the Keynesian economics still reigned supreme among the intellectual class. However, among our small circle of supply-siders, there was a real excitement and optimism in the air. With Ronald Reagan, the newly elected president, we knew that many of the ideas we had been developing and championing over the past several years would now be executed and implemented. And we knew that the potential of those ideas could reignite the great American growth machine. I'm honored to have many of the people who worked to bring about that supply-side revolution here with us today. David Asman, who was my first boss at the Institute, wrote and edited many of our early publications and served as editor-in-chief of the Manhattan Report, our supply-side economics journal. Jeff Bell, whose U.S. Senate campaign I worked on as a volunteer in 1978, which was the first supply-side political campaign in the nation, with its focus on tax cuts to restore economic growth. Jeff also introduced me to his own supply-side guru, the late Jude Wanniski. Art Laffer and Robert Mundell, the intellectual founding fathers of supply-side theory, will be here later, as well as Larry Kudlow and Lawrence Lindsay, who worked to translate supply-side ideas into policy as part of Ronald Reagan's economic team. And then there's Lou Lehrman, whose Lehrman Institute preceded the Manhattan Institute as a progenitor of supply-side ideas, and who was an early trustee of the Manhattan Institute. He even lent his East 71st Street townhouse as a home for our fledgling think tank for a number of years. Unfortunately, Bob Bartley, one of the central figures to the entire supply-side movement, is no longer with us. We are, however, honored that his wife, Edith, could join us here today. And later in the afternoon, we'll hear from Paul Gigot, who for a decade now has maintained and enhanced the reputation of the Wall Street Journal's op-ed page as the place to turn for sound economic thinking. We've put together this conference for a number of reasons. First, to celebrate and commemorate the 100th birthday of one of the great political figures of the 20th century, the extraordinary Ronald Reagan. Second, to remind people of the history of the supply-side revolution, when groups like the Manhattan Institute and the Wall Street Journal helped to popularize a unique paradigm which ultimately shaped the history of the country. And finally, in these challenging economic times, when people are once again talking about the inevitability of American decline, the need for a new politics of growth is back on the table. It seems like an auspicious time to have this discussion. Hopefully, today, the past will give us some guidance as to how we meet the challenges of our time and get the American economy growing again. Regarding today's agenda, we'll have two panel discussions with a short break in between. The first panel will focus on the history of the supply-side movement. The second will focus on the future and how we can put together a modern agenda for growth. We will then adjourn for lunch, after which Paul Gigot and Robert Mundell will talk about our current economic environment from an historical and global perspective. I'm now going to turn the podium over to a man who has played a key role in the entire Reagan Revolution and has never been shy about espousing those ideas. Please join me in welcoming Steve Forbes, who is here today in his capacity as a trustee of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation.
Well, thank you very much, Larry. It is a great privilege and pleasure to be here, to be the warm-up act for two fantastic panels and an extraordinary conversation you're going to get with Paul Gigot and Robert Mundell. It is a timely meeting, this meeting here today, a good one, not only to celebrate as part of the celebration of Reagan's 100th birthday, the centennial, but also to ask some very, very real questions. And it is fitting that this conference is sponsored by the Manhattan Institute, obviously the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, Don Paula Smith Foundation, but also the Wall Street Journal. Ideas do matter. And if you look at the history of journalism, for example, you had numerous press barons in the past always trying to achieve enormous influence. William Randolph Hearst in this country, eventually known as Citizen Kane, Beaver Brook and others in Canada and Britain. But what Bob Bartley did, and now Paul Gigot and his colleagues are doing today, demonstrate that if you have a purposeful platform based on Reagan-esque principles of progress and liberty, you will have outsized influence that lasts and makes a true change. Instead of flitting from issue to issue, as Hearst and others did, there was an enormous consistency in what the Journal did. It did make possible the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s. That was not inevitable. We could have continued to drift. If you look at the presidential candidates in 1980, looking back, it is clear only Ronald Reagan could have done what Reagan did. And so now as we prepare for 2012 and ultimately 2016, we have to ask ourselves, how do we prepare an environment where, yes, the crisis today does make possible enormous positive change? We have to understand what Reagan truly did. What I think enabled Reagan to connect with the American people, and we should not think that we can recreate Ronald Reagan. We are all too human to be able to do that. But we should understand, though, that if we have his outlook, share his basic outlook and principles and his belief in the American people, we will have an enormous transformation in this country and indeed around the world. He did believe in the essential goodness of the American people. He believed that America did have an exceptional role given by God to play in this world, and people sensed that basic optimism. It wasn't that he was a Pollyanna. He knew the underside of human nature. His father was an alcoholic, which scarred his childhood. But like our founders, he understood that if you have the right institutions, the right culture, the right attitudes, you can bring out the best in human nature, curb the worst instincts, and create an environment where innovators are allowed to innovate and where all people, as Abraham Lincoln put it, will have the opportunity to improve their lot in life. And because people sensed that, Ronald Reagan was able to do things that another political leader would not have been able to do, particularly when it had short-term political costs. Today, the Great Depression is always invoked as a comparison to the crisis we're in today. What's amazing, though, is how down the memory hole has gone what happened in the 1970s. That decade was a terrible decade. America seemed in terminal decline. Inflation was seen as a proof that democracy ultimately does not work. When people rule themselves, they cannot curb their worst appetites, and eventually even barriers created by our founders can be overcome, and inflation is the inevitable result. It will just get worse and worse, a terminal disease. Nothing you can really do about it except learn to live with it. The 1970s were marked by 3 ever more serious recessions, each worse than the last. As was indicated by Larry, and you'll hear it from the panels, 18% mortgage rates, 21.5% rates for businesses, unemployment higher than the level we have today, a stock market that in real terms was down 60% from what it was 15 years before, a bond market that had ceased to function except for treasuries. Companies couldn't do long-term financing as they have been able to do in the past. Overseas, we were in retreat. America's military had been really just ridden into the ditch. And yet, 8 years when Ronald Reagan left office, look what had happened. Inflation had been curbed. 18 million new jobs created. Silicon Valley not only blossomed, but became a symbol of innovation. The U.S. became the foremost global innovator. We won the Cold War. Saying those words doesn't underscore what a profound event that was. The Cold War was seen as something that was going to last our lifetimes and the lifetimes of our children and grandchildren. It was a permanent feature of life. Ronald Reagan was the only post-war president who really believed you could win the Cold War instead of practicing containment. And by golly, he did win the Cold War. He enabled America and the free world to win the Cold War. So that raised the question we're addressing today. How did he do it? Well, we all know how he did it. Series of tax cuts, 1981 tax cuts passed in August of 1981, massive across-the-board tax cuts. No other president would have been that bold to do it. Got bipartisan support for it, and you even had the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, a Democrat, urging the Republicans to knock the top rate from 70% to 50%, not over 3 years, but in 3 months. Can you imagine that today? That's what kind of environment he helped create. Spending, he did curb domestic spending, but also massively increased defense spending. Now, at the end of the decade, people will point out that national debt had increased by $1.7 trillion, back in a time when $1 trillion was real money. And people say, you know, all he did was deficit spend. No, the money went primarily to win the Cold War. That was a good investment. It won. And the thing to remember is the balance sheet, ladies and gentlemen, whenever they throw that canard up about Reagan's deficits, won by the end of his 8 years. If you take the declining federal deficit and state and local surpluses, I know saying states and surpluses is not 2 words you can connect these days very easily, the U.S. books were virtually in balance. And the thing to look at is the net wealth of the nation. The net wealth of the nation, even though the national debt had gone up $1.7 trillion to win the Cold War, the wealth of the nation had gone up $17 trillion. Reagan understood something very, very profound, that strength doesn't come from being a Spartan nation or a Prussian-esque nation. America's real strength came from its free markets. He had lived through it in World War II. He created the equivalent in the 1980s. With Silicon Valley booming, technology obviously being created in this country, it was clear we had outclassed the Soviet Union, and he pushed that advantage relentlessly. In World War II, Hermann Goering, before we entered the war, disparaged the American people's ability to fight because we're a raucous democracy. He said we're very good at making razor blades and other things, but as fighters, no way. He didn't realize the very processes, the very entrepreneurship that creates razor blades and so much else could be if we had to turn to military purposes. And just one little factoid, before World War II, Germany was proud that its Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had 3,500 aircraft of various kinds. By late 1943, American factories are turning out 7,000 aircraft each and every month. Reagan understood that power comes ultimately from freedom, and freedom and power used for principled purposes of enhancing liberty. So the tax cuts worked, the restraint on domestic spending worked, the increase on defense spending worked. He also killed the inflation. Monetary deregulation had started under Jimmy Carter, but Reagan pushed it relentlessly. And foreign policy was strong. So combined together, we won the Cold War, we got a strong nation, and he also was a man of rare courage. We forget, 1981, August, he fired all of those PATCO workers, all of those air controllers, every single one. That was a huge risk. He knew it was going to be disruptive, but he felt a point had to be made, and he made it. He didn't take a poll on that. He knew what had to be done, something some of our colleagues should keep in mind. So, this then raised the question we're going to be addressing today. Why in the world are we at where we are today? What went wrong? Why do we have the most statist presidency since the early 1930s? How, with the success of Ronald Reagan emulated throughout the world? Remember, ladies and gentlemen, the period from 1982 to 2007 was one of the most extraordinary periods in human history. Never before had so many people in so many parts of the world advanced so quickly economically as happened in that quarter of a century. Literally around the world, hundreds of millions of people joining the middle class. India opening up, China opening up, Indonesia becoming part of the global market, Vietnam and numerous others. And so the old authoritarian regimes were becoming more and more isolated, and the totalitarian ones hideous relics like North Korea or Cuba. What in the world went wrong? Well, first, the virus of Keynesianism, statism, never really was expunged. It was just there, ready for the right environment to explode again, which we saw with gleefulness on their part in 2008, 2009. The New Deal had never in their minds been discredited. They had forgotten about the 1970s. They thought that wise people like themselves could masterfully manipulate government, could do great things. You know, politicians are always affected with what you might call the pyramid complex. They always want to be taking credit for doing great things. Now, in the private sector, you do great things. You want to build a building, fine, it's your own money. But in politics, they want to use the public money to create their monuments. If you want to see it, go out on the turnpike and see the Frank R. Lautenberg train station. That's his pyramid, this little pharaoh. So, but you have this attitude out there that government can guide. You can trace it to the progressive era. You can trace it back even before then. And so that was still there. That virus, intellectual virus, was still there. And so it came out again. Well, why did it come out again? Why did it have another round of innings? Well, this then gets to monetary policy. One of the things that was not completed in the Reagan Revolution was, yes, the inflation was conquered when people felt the U.S. was no longer purposely trashing the dollar. People trusted the greenback again, which enabled the great globalization of the 80s, 90s, and most of the last decade. But in terms of the Reagan Revolution, that was incomplete. You still had the battles between monetarists who thought you could directly affect the money supply and guide the economy. What we call the gold bugs. I'm one of them, who felt that ultimately the dollar had to be tied to gold. That debate was never fully resolved. So the dollar's relative strength after Reagan was on very shaky ground. The intellectual framework was not there to support it. And when the dollar was undermined, first under the Bush administration, now even worse under the Obama administration, there was no immediate intellectual counterattack to say, no, this is profoundly wrong, it's going to lead to disaster. You never could have had the housing bubble if the Fed hadn't printed so much money. And yet free markets got the blame for it. When the Fed engaged in violent monetary policy, up and down, it was blamed on free markets. Fannie and Freddie, we all know the role they played. Government creations, mark-to-market accounting, which nearly destroyed the capital system in 2008, 2009. When that was finally amended in March of 2009, the stock market came back to life. And one thing on mark-to-market, boring though it is if we'd had that same principle in place 20 years before when you had a banking crisis, all the major commercial banks would have gone under because all their Latin loans on the books would have been worth about 10 cents on the dollar. So huge mistakes were made. Free markets are blamed for it. The virus came back again. So where do we go from here? Well, that's what we're here this morning to discuss. I think what's going to come out of this is that Obama is the last stand for statism. This is their last chance. He was the true anti-Reagan. He knew Reagan was a transformational president. He was determined to be the transformational president for statism and socialism, whatever words you want to use, but something went totally against the character of the American nation except for a brief period in the early 1930s. So in this conference today, we'll discuss with the panels what enabled Reagan to succeed, understanding that while times and circumstances change, the principles of progress and liberty do not change. And then another panel, where do we go from here? And it's very, very fitting that we end with Paul and Bob to discuss monetary policy. That is going to be a major issue again. If we were winning the fight on spending, if we win the fight on understanding about monetary policy, by golly, what Ronald Reagan stood for will triumph again. And what happened in the last years will be seen as a regrettable, destructive, but unpermanent interruption of what Ronald Reagan bequeathed us and a free world. Thank you very much.
We had a little dinner last night to kind of get us acquainted with the subject matter, where we were going to go, and there was a wonderful, I wish you all could have been there, a great series of debates with Bob Mundell. Bob being, of course, the academic spiritual founder of supply-side economics. If Ronald Reagan was the political spiritual leader, Bob Mundell was the academic one. And we were trying to figure out how we did it, how we actually, I came to, as Larry said, I came to the Manhattan Institute in the summer of 1980, right before Reagan was elected. And we really didn't know, I think, the enormity of what was about to happen. We didn't realize that we were about to completely revolutionize the way the economy worked and the way the political structure worked and the way our whole society was going to sort of reformulate itself under Reagan's leadership. And Bob Mundell suggested a lot of it was just kismet, was just fate. He even suggested that the movie Taxi Driver had more to do with Reagan's success in changing the economy, the supply-side revolution, than anything else. You all know why? Because of the fact that Hinckley was inspired by the movie Taxi Driver to shoot Ronald Reagan, and had Ronald Reagan not been shot at that particular moment when he was trying to pass the Economic Recovery Act, he wouldn't have had the sympathy he needed to get it passed. Because after he was shot, he could virtually get anything done he wanted to get done. So according to Bob Mundell, the movie Taxi Driver had more to do with the trillions of dollars of wealth that were created in the 1980s than anything else. I think I'm a little more practical, partly because I was at the Manhattan Institute when these great minds were coming around to try to change things. And we through a guy who hasn't been mentioned, Bill Hammett, who was the one who actually came up with the name the Manhattan Institute. He was my first boss there, as well as George Gilder. He recognized several areas, 3 or 4 key areas that had to be attacked, that were preventing the kind of message that supply-side economics, both economic and social message that it wanted to impart on our culture. And those areas that were resistant to that change were academia, of course. The academic community was almost overwhelmingly hostile to the idea, with certain exceptions like Bob Mundell and others. The media itself, of course, there was no Fox News then, of course, there was no internet then. The news was derived primarily from 3 half-hour programs at night on television, and the New York Times and the Washington Post set the agenda. The editorial page of the Journal had not yet reached its zenith, so the media had to be attacked, and the popular culture also. We began to see rumblings, even before the internet and before the Tea Parties of their predecessors, people like Howard Jarvis, who, of course, Art worked with, and the Proposition 13 folks, and Ronald Reagan, of course, credited these local, so again, I would say early on Tea Party movements that were happening all over the country that were against the statism that was the main enemy of supply-siders. So those areas were areas that we set out to attack. or at least to infiltrate, if not attack, to attack the wrongs that they were perpetrating through their writings and through their studies, but also to infiltrate in terms of finding young students who might become teachers one day and professors, helping them in their research, helping to publish what they did, finding young writers in economic media, whether it was Fortune magazine or economic writers, I put it in quotation marks, at Time magazine and Newsweek, who actually were so ill-informed that they were easy to get to, because their arguments weren't making any sense, sort of like the Obama economic policy. We'd seen through the Carter years that these policies weren't working, with the exception of some anti-regulatory work that was pretty good that Carter did, but that was about it. So we were able to present them with ideas about what the supply side revolution was going to be and was all about. And of course, we used the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which I then went on to join. But by going after these areas of influence that are still held primarily by people that are hostile to supply side economics and the whole supply side, the whole Reagan Revolution, we were able to at least get an opening. And through the academic work that our colleagues here have done, through the political work that they've done, as Art did directly in the administration and then in local politics in California and throughout the nation. Of course, Jeff was also involved deeply in the academic fight. Actually try to get elected, to try to put elected officials into office that had a clear understanding of supply-side economics. And there, of course, already were some. The whole Economic Recovery Act could not have happened without Jack Kemp, without Kemp Roth. And that did precede the revolution, the Reagan Revolution itself. So it was started, but the question is how what we did then could be applied to now, because a lot of things have changed, and I think things have changed for the better. We do have Fox News now. We do have the internet now. We do have a huge number of movements that are happening throughout the country that are beginning to coalesce into some kind of movement. It's still ill-defined what the Tea Party is, but we saw from the election in November that it is something that can be coalesced into political power. And it does, ranges through all kinds of issues, from immigration to economics, but there is at its core, I think, the core values that Ronald Reagan had and the core values that supply-side economics represents. So how do we use the experience we had then, experiences that these gentlemen either document or actually were a part of, how do we use those experiences, the successes of those years, to inform us about how to become successful in the coming years? I think that's what we should talk about here. So drawing from the past, but not just dwelling on the past, drawing from the past and applying it to what we have now. And I want to start with the Laffer curve man himself, Art Laffer, who of course devised many of the theorems that were used, I'm sure he would say came directly from economics. It wasn't out of his head into policy. It was his recognition of stuff that existed. But how can we inform the political, the sort of political, popular, social movements that are taking place right now by what we did back in the 80s?
You told me there wasn't going to be a speech this morning.
No, we're just going to open it up. By the way,
let me just say that the one thing I thought was so cool about Ronald Reagan is he wanted to win, not fight. And you know, whenever you fight, both of you lose. You may lose less than the guy you beat up, but you both lose. And Ronald Reagan really tried to bring the opposition in as much as he could into the revolution to show them the way, rather than to force it down their throats. I remember there were two economists I knew pretty well back then before we came into office. Both of them were Texans. One was a guy named Phil Graham. Phil Graham was on the House Ways and Means Committee, a Democrat from Texas. Another one was a good friend of mine. He had Mahon's old district in Texas up in Lubbock, a guy named Kent Hance. And these were both congressmen from Texas, Democrats, that were the co-sponsors of both of our bills. You may remember it was Graham Latta and it was Hance Conable were the two bills. By doing that, and I don't know if you remember the initial actions plan of the president was how to keep these bills out of Congress. Do not let congressmen ever write a bill because they'll make a partisan bill that becomes hostile and aggressive and all of that. You never want to do that. We took control of the bills, and as it turned out, we were able to get huge amounts of Democrats voting for our bills in 1981. I mean, I think in the Senate it was 89 to 11, which passed both bills. 35 Democrats voted with Reagan. Can you imagine that today? The thing that's even harder to imagine is one Republican voted with them. But you know, it's that part of Reagan that was so wonderful. I don't remember Reagan ever being hostile or aggressive. He did have a couple of one-liners that may have been zingy when he said the deficit reminds him of Tip O'Neill. Big, fat, and out of control. You know, there were a couple of those, but not many. I mean, he wasn't a hostile guy at all. And, you know, he was funny all the way. It's his centennial. Can I tell one story and then pass it on, David? You know, I was with him on his 65th birthday when he was in Illinois. Jeff, I think you were there, campaigning in Illinois against Jerry Ford in the primary in '76. He turned 65. And then I was with him on his 73rd birthday in the White House in 1983. He turned 72, I guess it was. And there used to be a thing there that Social Security, before it was changed, it was called the retirement test. Between the ages of 65 and 72, every dollar you earned, you lost 50 cents in Social Security benefits. And because of Reagan's high earning power, he had never received a Social Security check. So there we were sitting there in the Roosevelt room, and he comes in and says, "Lady, you just can't believe it. Today I turned 73 and I've got my first Social Security check, and I'm living in public housing." It doesn't get any better. But David, if I can just add one thing, he was humorful. He was a nice man, and that goes a long way in this world. He was civilized and nice. But I would like to mention a couple people who aren't here today. Can I do that with you? I mean, obviously you've mentioned Bob Bartley. Steve mentioned Bob Bartley. Bob Novak. Boy, without him, it would have been really tough. Jack Kemp. I mean, here was what Jude Winniski called the weapon. And of course, I have to mention
Before you go on, though, Jack Kemp is represented, I think, pretty well by Paul Ryan, who Paul Ryan used as his mentor for his formative years in his 20s, Jack Kemp. He used to follow Jack Kemp around. So Jack Kemp's spirit is now alive in the Budget Committee in the Congress.
I think all those spirits are alive, to be honest with you. I mean, I think Jack's alive. If you look at Milton Friedman, I mean, Milton Friedman was a very powerful role, and no one can underplay the role he made. And, of course, you had Jarvis and Gann, as you mentioned. They were really important. And my favorite, I think, is if you go back to the olden days, and I know most of you did not know Reagan socially. My godfather was a man named Justin Dart. And so those of us in LA had a social group that has been greatly underplayed in the Reagan Revolution, and it really has been. If you ever read any of Coachella's pieces, you'll see that the kitchen cabinet, all the old timers in California were there, really important. But my godfather, Justin Dart, I think was an enormous influence. And Jeff, you probably do. But they're all in there today. And the Reagan Revolution, God bless it, it's going to live on. And I tell the joke, I used to tease the real president, and you all know who I mean by that, Reagan. I used to tease him that it was my professional judgment as a professor, as an academic, as an economist. It's my professional judgment that you, sir, truly are a certifiable genius. However, some of my colleagues, sir, at the university are not overly impressed with my assessment of your intellectual acumen. In fact, some of my colleagues actually don't think you're very bright. But the one thing my colleagues and I do agree upon is that your one unique characteristic is your uncanny ability to select your four predecessors. Anyone following in the heels of Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter just can't look bad. And if I may say this, and everyone else, all of you know him as well, so I believe that Ronald Reagan would have been a very different president had he won the presidency in 1976. I really think he would have been not the Reagan we know and love, at least not so much so. That in all honesty, it took Jimmy Carter to create Ronald Reagan. And in the same breath that it took Jimmy Carter to create Ronald Reagan, you cannot imagine the great president that's going to follow Barack Obama.
Let me move over to Jeff Bell, who was just leaving the Manhattan Institute when I was joining in that summer of 1980. Art brings up a great point, which is that Democrats were absolutely critical. Of course, some like Graham became a Republican and others, but they were a very key part. The Economic Recovery Act could not have been passed without them. A lot of the, of course, there were what we called Scoop Jackson Democrats back then. I guess they'd be Blue Dogs now. But are there any Democrats now that would be willing to go along, you think, with a new supply side agenda?
No.
Well, there you have it.
That's I'm done. No, Reagan was good at attracting people who were not naturally with him, particularly in popular opinion. The elites, I think, felt enormous pressure from his popularity, how he would go over the heads of the congressmen, of the political elites, and make it almost impossible for a Democrat in a conservative district to vote against him. But I think that it was a very divisive and partisan fight during the time when Reagan's election and the supply side revolution was in doubt. And I think it's very typical of Art Laffer that he gave his little talk without mentioning the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve, I think, was integral to making it hard for Democrats to resist the need to cut tax rates. You had this phenomenon of bracket creep where inflation was pushing people up into new tax brackets never designed for them. And so that made people very discontent. But it would have been very hard to close the deal if you could not demonstrate from history, as Art did, that tax rates can be set so high that they're counterproductive, that they actively suppress the revenue. And it had happened again and again. On paper, tax cuts, or tariff cuts for that matter, were not supposed to gain so much revenue, but if they were on that lower half of the Laffer curve, they did. They actually increased the condition of the Treasury, improved it. Now, the fascinating thing to me is that the Laffer curve was the top target of the other side of the debate. They absolutely went nuts whenever Reagan or Kemp or anyone else mentioned this phenomenon. And it's the part of supply side that tends not to get mentioned now, or it's written off as an exaggeration. I think it says something about the divide, particularly in academia, elite opinion, that the Laffer curve is, with all due respect to Art, is not a new theory. The Laffer curve is a truism. It's something that has always been true. You can obviously set a 100% tax rate that brings in no revenue, and that applies down to a level that, you have to calculate given the situation. But it's been so completely suppressed that we've lost sight of the fact that it literally has to be true that a tax rate could be set counterproductively high. I think it was interesting that President Obama, when he was campaigning for the Democratic nomination, acknowledged it when, in response to a question from Charlie Gibson of ABC, he said, there's this one tax rate that always seems to produce more revenue when you cut it, and that's the capital gains tax. Why would you want to raise, and he was for almost doubling it at that time, why would you want to have a stiff increase on that tax rate? And Obama said, well, yeah, that's one thing in his favor, but the other issue is fairness. In other words, Obama didn't argue with the fact that capital gains tax cuts had often added to the revenue, or that raising them would be counterproductive, would suppress revenue. He made it clear, and I think it was an unusual moment, that it was all about distribution, about fairness, and he didn't care that raising the capital gains tax rate would probably, given the history, suppress the revenue. That's how fanatical they are about this point, the left, and most elites.
Although there is a slight change in talk now coming from the White House, particularly since the compromises that were made on taxes in December and January, and one of those is they did, Austin Goolsbee, one of his chief economic advisors, suggested that if you do lower the tax rate, corporate tax rate, you could possibly get more income. I mean, he gave a nod to the Laffer curve.
Everybody knows it's true.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things that you can never integrate into an economics department at a university. I think that says something about where we are in terms of the relationship of reality to the political debate.
Let me bring Brian in. Brian Domitrovic is the author of Econoclass, and he had the wonderful opportunity from a historian's perspective to tackle a subject that had never been tackled, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but no academic historian had really concentrated on the phenomena of the supply side movement and what it meant to life. One thing that Jeff was saying is that bracket creep had so ravaged the economy, and the middle class in America, who, because of the creeping tax brackets, became sort of mini supply-siders themselves without maybe knowing it. We don't have that bracket creep right now. And so we don't have we have the impetus of the Tea Party and all of the things they're against in terms of big government, but that direct attack on higher income from bracket creep is not existing now. Do we need some kind of impetus like bracket creep, as negative as it is, to get people into a real sort of revolutionary mode, or are they already there without it?
You know, one thing I noticed in investigating the history of supply-side economics is that it wasn't just Reagan's leadership. I mean, Reagan was a phenomenal president, but the ship was going in the right direction. I mean, the 1970s were a tinderbox that were soaked with gasoline, and they were just about to explode. When you have a progressive tax structure with 26 rates, and you're running 14% inflation a year, which is the case in 1980, in order for an average worker with average income to get a raise that is equal to the cost of living, he has to get a raise that is 50% above the inflation rate. Well, the inflation rate is 14%, so that means he has to get 14 up to 21%. Can you imagine a firm giving 21% raises to all its employees just so that they can match the taxes they have to pay in order to maintain their standard of living? Well, that implies their revenues are going up by 21%. But we know they're not going up by 21% because they're going up by 14%. That's the rate of inflation. It just became impossible for this system to occur. So I'm actually going to disagree with Bob Mundell a little bit, because before Reagan was shot, the Democrats in Congress, William Broadhead, had introduced an amendment to the Reagan tax bill which would decrease the top tax rate from 70 to 50 right away. Their alternative to Kemp-Roth was not a 10-10-10 3-year rate reduction, but just a 2-year rate reduction of 10-10. Well, the Reagan bill went to 5-10-10. So the Democratic alternative was actually very close to what was happening. No, the whole structure of the malaise that was the 1970s was just conducing to the Reagan Revolution, and Reagan's leadership was simply taking the country where it wanted to go.
It's a commonly asked question, but could the Reagan Revolution happen now without Ronald Reagan? I mean, I'm getting a sense from certainly from Art, little less so from Jeff, and certainly less so from you, Brian, that it's not necessary to have a Reagan-like figure to put forth that kind of contrast to Obamanomics. Do you agree, or?
Well, I mean, let me tell you, if Jimmy Carter had won in 1980, I mean, we know what
If you can say Reaganomics, you can say Obamanomics, right?
We have the records that Jimmy Carter had in his 1980 campaign about what would happen in another 4 years of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter said if we stay the course with price controls, with increasing the progressivity of the tax code, so forth, we will have 6% growth by 1984 with a $100 billion budget surplus. Okay? So, right, if Jimmy Carter is reelected in 1980, then the United States just goes into the sinkhole, right? But it was impossible for Jimmy Carter to get elected in 1980 because the nation simply yearned for that kind of leadership. I don't think we're at quite that point of crisis these days. We could get there rapidly, and I think Ronald Reagan will materialize from the ether.
Yeah, I don't think we need a Reagan figure to go forward. I mean, you got to remember that today is 1978. And when Jeff, your point about the partisanship in '78 was outrageous. It took a Reagan to make it bipartisan. And to be honest with you, I know a lot of the Democrats in the House and the Senate. I've known them for a long time. If they know it's wrong what's going on, every single one of them does. They're partisan, they're loyal today, but if given the right opportunity, I think they could come along and do it. To Brian's point, there were lots of changes occurring that were coming in with Reagan that made it really happen as well. Reagan was the catalyst, and boy, what a catalyst he was. But I think the movement was well on its way by the time that happened.
But Jeff, do you see a catalyst like Reagan out there right now?
I'd say there are two differences between now and the 1970s in terms of the political grassroots. There isn't somebody like Reagan who has worked his way toward a comprehensive solution to the economy and also to other issues. He had a definite theory of missile defense being the key to winning the Cold War, as well as the Reagan doctrine of aid to anti-communist guerrillas in communist countries. He had a belief system that was integrated across several issue areas. There isn't anyone like that now that I'm aware of who is running for president, or even anyone in Congress. What is better now than it was then is the grassroots is much more active. You could have an individual tax revolt in California which had some peculiarities about the way their property taxes worked that were particularly problematic for homeowners. You could have a statewide and to some degree a nationwide tax revolt due to bracket creep, but you didn't have a principled movement the way we have the Tea Party today. The Tea Party is not going to go away as the economy improves, at least in my opinion, because it is a larger concern about the need to get back to the values of the founders. It's a normative belief system. It's much more like social conservatism than it is like just an economic revolt, a situational movement. And so the emergence of the Tea Party gives the raw material for a Reagan, or even a partial Reagan, who had some of Reagan's vision and is willing to offer it to the American people. Right now, I don't see candidates for president doing that, but the race is so boring and so unformed that I honestly think that the candidates themselves really don't know what the race is about. I think that's the biggest reason for the postponement of it.
The country just seems ready. I mean, you know, it didn't take much. I mean, the spark was Centelli on CNBC. I mean, you know, that wasn't really a spark. He just put a name to something that was happening throughout the country, and they picked up on the name that he announced. So there does seem to be a fertility among the public, among the populace, among voters that exists now that existed in 1980, no?
Yeah, I mean, one of the greatest constituents of American identity is American prosperity. I mean, it is simply impossible for America to be America unless the nation is prosperous. There's only one example in all of American history where there was an extended bout of general poverty, and that's the Great Depression. It's simply an anomaly. So therefore, when we started to see signs that maybe we're going to have to live in an unprosperous fashion for a while, it was only natural for Americans to say, well, we can't do that. That's not in our DNA. So therefore, we naturally do have Tea Party phenomena. Now, because of the Reagan Revolution, because the marginal tax rate's only 35% as opposed to 70%, it's not going to get as bad as it was in the 1970s.
But it's not.
Does that mean that there's not going to be enough popular anger? Well,
it's not a tax rate revolution today. We've won the tax rate issue, to be real honest with you. I mean, we have. Obama, with his Congress, the lame duck Congress, couldn't stop the extension of the tax cuts on the upper incomes. He couldn't do it. The two Gateses in Washington State wanting to do their tax starting at $500,000 income and then being up to 9% at $1 million income, they lost 2-1. The tax rate issue is over.
Cuomo is with Republicans now, at least for the moment, in New York, in terms of the millionaires.
Well, it's great. I mean, Cuomo's. This is where the tax rate issue, I don't think, is our issue today. The wedge, what comes between wages paid and wages received, is much more than just tax rates. The tax rate example was what we used in the 70s because it was so egregious. It really was egregious. I mean, 91% rates. I mean, God, 70% on unearned income, which, of course, is much more difficult to earn than earned income. The Democrats were the ones that brought in the cut in the unearned income tax rate. That was from 70 to 50%. In fact, Reagan had not proposed that. I was in the Oval Office with him that day that we had the vote in there. They had Wirthlin and Deaver and said, well, what should we do? Should we accept the Broadhead Amendment or not? I mean, I sort of like it, Reagan said. Any objections? And no objections. Well, I guess we go with it. And Charlie Walker, in his own stand, he said, I can make money on that, sir. You know, and we off and running. But, you know, today it's a different thing. Today, let me give you Obamacare. I mean, Obamacare, it doesn't matter whether it balances the budget, leads to deficits, or leads to surpluses. The thing is, it misassociates effort and reward. That's the problem with Obamacare. I mean, what you do is you pay a lump sum and you buy the product at way below cost. It's like me being in a smorgasbord, you know, where I pay a lump sum and I can eat all I want. You know, I'm going to way overeat and I'm going to go right to the caviar until I throw up. You know, Phil Graham, I think, put it perfectly. I had that debate in Intelligence Squared where Phil and I took on Nouriel Roubini and Laura Tyson, beat the living hell out of them. Just teasing. We did. But Phil Graham put it this way. He said, if I could buy my health care, if I could buy my groceries the way I could buy my health care, where I only had to pay 5 cents on the dollar, I'd eat real well. And so would my dog. We have a problem with welfare spending today. It is a different battle than it was. Government spending as a share of GDP, federal, it's 27, 28% of GDP. It wasn't that during Reagan. That's where our problem is. And if you don't think government spending hurts the economy, wake up and smell the coffee. You know, to understand how stimulus spending hurts the economy, you got to see it. Even with 350 million people and Chinese debt flowing in and mortgage-backed securities and monetary base and velocity, it becomes so confusing to do all the T accounts. If it's good economics, it works in a two-person world. Imagine a world of two farmers, okay? Farmer 1 and Farmer 2. If Farmer 2 gets unemployment benefits, who do you think pays for them? Am I going way over your heads today? Government spending is the tax. Now, that doesn't mean that all government spending isn't good. Of course it is. But it's worth the tax to get the government services. But stimulus spending is all bad all the time because they don't look at the quality of the product the government's spending on. It's building, digging ditches and filling them up again. That spending is bad. Today, our problem is much more government spending than it is tax rates. And you know, back in the 70s, everyone, I remember Holmes Tuttle yelling at me, for God's sakes, Art, cut that tax rate crap up until we balance the budget. And in fact, we did the one even before Kemp Roth. If any of you remember, we had something called Nunn-Hart, which was sponsored by 2 Democrats, which was the 30% across the board cut that I'd worked with Sam and Gary on doing that. But they had it triggered only when we hit surpluses. Then we got the tax cuts. You know, today it is spending. And today it is free trade. And today it is regulations.
Well, that's regulation is the other. For every dollar that you spend, you have to have a new regulation for the ways in which it's spent. And the regulation tax is now overtaken, talking to small business people, the regulation tax has overtaken the actual tax rate is the biggest concern to a lot of small businesses.
Well, I'll tell you one number, which is, these are IRS numbers. If you take the total costs of the income tax, I'm not talking about changing your behavior or anything there. You get about $1.3 trillion collected on the income tax. The total amount of money spent just to pay those taxes. You have the accounting firms, you have the, the tax filling firms, you have the people's hours they do, and all of that stuff. The total cost of the IRS, if you take the total cost, all right, is about $450 billion as estimated by the IRS. For every dollar in taxes paid, there's 40 cents paid in filing and filling in and doing your taxes. That is outrageous, people. That's why you want a low-rate, flat tax.
Well, let me just ask, because this is another one point at which some people in the Obama administration seem to be perking up their ears in terms of getting rid of the deductions and lowering the rates. Are they serious on this, or is this just a political ploy? First to you, and then to Jeff.
It's a political ploy, but no, go ahead.
But is there any seriousness
there? Of course. Austin Cool's would love to do it, and so would Gene Sperling. But I don't think...
Jeff, will it happen? Is there any chance that they could be persuaded over to getting into a Steve Forbes-like flat tax, or closer to it anyway?
It's conceivable, but only if a whole lot of other things are going wrong or going into place. There's absolutely no impetus to reform the tax code in the Obama administration, in my opinion. I mean, there wasn't any impetus to intervene in Libya either, but, you know, pressures happened and they eventually did. But I don't think that tax reform is near to the president's heart.
So what does that mean over the next 2 years? Are we just going to go deeper and deeper into a ditch before the 2012 election, Brian?
Oh, well, the CBO makes it very clear that we're going to run up deficits way higher than even the immoderate projections of the Obama administration. I mean, there's only one way to get out of the fiscal ditch, and that's through economic growth. I mean, it's the only way. We know how to get economic growth. I mean, you have to have a sound monetary system, low taxes, low regulation, and a shrinking state. It's real simple. Those are the 4 pillars of Reaganomics. Yet we've made least progress on the monetary system. I mean, even conservatives debate, well, shouldn't we just have a rule-based discretionary monetary policy? That's probably wrong. We should go back to a convertible dollar standard. In the 19th century, when we were growing at 5–6% a year for half-century long periods, we had a convertible dollar. That's the final reform that was never attended to in any official manner during the Reagan years.
You know, Steve Forbes last night at the dinner that you missed said the biggest applause line he gets for his speeches is "make the dollar as good as gold." Is that right, Steve? So do you think it's possible to get people enthusiastic about that on a campaign?
Oh, in a few years it will be very possible. I mean, given what Bernanke's doing. I hope I'm not going way over your heads here, but if you have a bumper crop in apples, what happens to the value of each apple? Down. You with me? If you have a bumper crop in the production of money, if you flood the market with dollar bills, the largest increase in the monetary base in the history of the U.S. from revolutionary times to the present, times 10, M1's growing like mad. Believe me when I tell you inflation is coming. And it's coming, and it's going to be big. By the time it hits, we will be able to reform the monetary system. Till then, you probably can't gin up the enthusiasm for it. But when you get a 21.5% prime, which was what we had when we took office, it's not hard.
But Jeff, one thing President Reagan was always strict about was making sure that people knew what he felt about the dollar, that the dollar should be as good as gold. I mean, he said it a million times. Was it just rhetoric, or do you think it hit home with the voters? Could it now, too?
Well, I think the paper standard, as opposed to the gold standard, gold exchange standard, was saved because 2 extraordinary men took office. One was Ronald Reagan, and the other was Paul Volcker. And they are the only 2 people in the world who could have made the paper standard work for as long as it did, for those 25 years that Steve Forbes alluded to, because subsequent Fed chairmen and subsequent presidents were living off of the credibility that those 2 men had achieved for U.S. monetary policy. Now, the string has run out. There are 2 aspects to the Keynesian elitism of the Obama administration. One is the so-called stimulus, flooding the fiscal side with dollars. The other is the Krugmania on the monetary side, which is 0 interest rates prolonged well into the 3rd year, quantitative easing. This is an attempt of the elites in Washington to throw money at the monetary side, and it's just as unavailing as deficit spending. And that is the part, I would agree with Brian, that is the part that's been underaddressed by our congressmen, by the Republicans. I don't blame the Tea Party, because I've done focus groups with the Tea Party. They are very interested in this subject. They're waiting.
And it hasn't been underaddressed by by Ron Paul, who is now leading a subcommittee to investigate what the Fed has been doing.
But it is underaddressed by Paul Ryan, with all due respect to him. He asked Bernanke for his approval during a hearing the other day for the spending cuts that he is proposing. he asking him for approval. I mean, he approved the spending increases under Obama. Every Fed chairman butters the bread of the president who is in office because he's interested in getting reappointed. And to asking Bernanke for approval, yeah, you approve the spending increases, now you approve the spending cuts because the Republicans have the House. That says to me that he is insecure or unwilling or just opposed to addressing the monetary side of Keynesian Krugmania.
All right, well, one thing that Reagan was great at, Brian, was bringing Republicans together. Bringing Republicans together. He not only brought a nation together, but first he brought Republicans together. By that, you know, we're not going to criticize a fellow Republican. He really lived by that rule. And it did bring now you see Republicans all over. You just heard Jeff criticizing Paul Ryan. You hear a lot of people criticizing John Boehner. You hear a lot of people, you know, taking out even on things like Libya. Now Republicans are totally divided on whether, you know, no-fly zones are good. Is it necessary, if Republicans are going to win in 2012, win the White House, is it necessary for somebody to draw them in? Because you don't see it from the leadership in the House, or at least I don't.
You just have to start with the principles, and the principles are low and simple taxation, shrinking government in the context of prosperity, free trade, and a sound dollar. I mean, those are the things. When you look at Gerald Ford's speeches, for example, I mean, his inflation speech is 1974. He's saying, I'm sending my Commerce Secretary out there, I'm giving him marching orders to go control prices. Right, okay, that's not Republicanism. I mean, Republicanism has to be the four pillars of Reaganomics. There's no way that Republicans are going to be attracted to this idea unless the concept is there is going to be robust, epic, typical old-fashioned American growth in the future. If the idea is we're going to do this and there's going to be some kind of 10-year period of weirdness, of course it's not going to attract anyone. But as Mundell said as early as 1971, and he said this throughout his career, there are no economic costs to the right policy mix.
That's correct.
None. As soon as you get sound money and low taxes, the economy's off to the races forever.
Period.
Yeah.
You know, and you're a little unfair about the Republicans. I mean, I went to the Baltimore offsite with all the congressional Republicans, and there were a couple of us from the outside there. I went a day early to sort of hang with the homeboys, if you will, and sort of see all my old friends and everything. Look at what they did. The first thing they did, when Newt Gingrich took over, did they repeal Clinton's tax increase? No, they could have. But what's the first thing the Republicans did in the House? They repealed Obamacare. Every single Republican in the House voted to repeal Obamacare. In fact, we got a couple Democrats. In the Senate, all 47 Republicans in the Senate voted to repeal Obamacare. That includes Collins and Snowe. Hey, the Republicans are really unified. My best guess, I don't know if any of you saw Peter Ferrara's and Newt Gingrich's editorial the other day, which is really perfect. I mean, let's just have them extend the tax cuts and make them permanent and see what the Democrats do.
But Art, hold on, because
the Republicans are unified.
Well, I hear a lot of people out of school. I mean, that's one thing that they saying, geez, I wish the hell Boehner would get serious about growth issues. He's not something. I mean, there are a lot of people that question.
You're being mean. You're being
no, and I'm not trying to stir up trouble. I'm just telling you what I hear.
You know, the high road to China. The old thing was you got to go up there by oxen. My God, and the old Chinese guy says, oxen are slow, but the world, she is patient. We have lived under this garbage for how long now? So if it takes us 6 months, give me a break. You know, this is a long horizon. We are owners of this country, not renters. And our dream is to make the capital stock of America 30, 50 years from now worth as much as we possibly can. Do it slow and do it right and get it done correctly. Low rate flat tax, Brian says, spending restraint, sound money, free trade, and regulations that do not go beyond the purpose at hand and do collateral damage. That's it, people. And the more Democrats we bring in with us, and the more we convert to our way of thinking, the longer, the deeper, and the more powerful this change will be. Of course, you know I agree with Steve on sound money. But this is not a war. This is really creating an America that will give us the prosperity and growth, not for a week, not for a month, not for a year, but for the next half century.
Jeff?
Well, how would you take that question that Charlie Gibson did? And President Obama said, yes, I understand the Laffer curve, but I want to double the tax rates anyway, Would you take that as a sign of bipartisanship?
No, but would you take the bipartisanship of that time and you realize what Obama was coming into and coming from? He was coming from W and all the TARP spending, the $600 per capita that Bush signed into law, the stimulus spending from the agriculture bill, from the House bill, from Paulson's thing there. I mean, from nationalizing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That was all done under a Republican president. And here you have Obama just extending those policies. No, he's wrong, and he's going to get hammered for those mistakes. But hopefully we can bring the Democrats into our side. That's all, Jeff. We need to win this one. And winning is our primary goal, not fighting. Just because you silence someone doesn't mean you've convinced them. We need to do exactly what we did with the 70s and 80s of really showing them that this stuff works.
Well, and the extraordinary thing about what happened in '80 was, as I said before, there was no Fox News, there was no internet. Every newspaper, you cannot overemphasize how much the public was told night after night after night that if Reagan was elected, we'd be at war with the Soviets in 6 months. The economy, 14% inflation was nothing. We'd double that, and interest rates would go into the 30s.
Don't you love them?
Every single night we were told this. Academe, as bad as Academe is now, back then, I mean,
it was much worse.
It was worse.
Much worse.
And yet Reagan won overwhelmingly. So I mean, with the other media advantages and the other academic advantages and the popular revolt that's going on, it looks like there's just one ingredient that's missing.
Yeah, but the time, you know, things come in their time. We're going to increase our control of the House. We're going to get control of the Senate in 2013. You know, Obama, unless he switches dramatically, will be a one-termer. And you know, what happens in the crucible of these primaries is it creates Ronald Reagan. As I tried to say, Ronald Reagan in '76 would not have been the same person. This is where the people practice their ideas and debate. We've got tons of wonderful people in the Republican field who can do a great, great job. I mean, I still hope Steve Forbes runs again, damn it.
What about Art Laffer?
Yeah, right. You know, I would retire just as long as I get my pension. When you're my age, you're drooling all the time.
Do you notice, probably you haven't read the book that this is referring, but do you know what book this is a slap in the face of, the cover of this book? Has anybody seen Paul Krugman's book? This is a mirror image of that, is that correct? Has he called you about that?
He's maintained studio silence.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, it is time for us to call a halt to this. But I just a very quick lightning round or one question as to who's going to win. Will Obama have another term? Jeff, do you think?
I think he'll be defeated, but it's important that he be defeated by somebody who has a clear-cut set of principles and an agenda and has that going in. I think that's what's...
And it's possible there won't be such a candidate that will beat him.
People have free will. Things are completely undecided.
Brian?
2 quick points. I do think Obama will win in 2012, and if Reagan hadn't been a good president, if he had come in '76, it's because Jack Kemp hadn't introduced Kemp Roth yet. We have to remember Jack Kemp's role.
That's right.
Yeah, I think the best is yet to come. I think this is going to be the most exciting couple of decades in front of us. It's going to be better than the 80s and 90s. I couldn't be more excited than I am today about the future of this country. It's just...
Better than the 7 fat years?
God, if you think you made money in the 80s with our economics, wait till you see the decade of the 10s and the 20s. This is just a rocket ship ready to launch.
All right.
America is so set for a political transformation.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you, guys. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
David, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.